What is up, everybody? This is Josh, and today I'm bringing you guys a Master Duel video because we've just gotten a huge set in the game introducing the Mulcharmies among some other stuff for existing archetypes, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about how these Mulcharmies impact the metagame as a whole, and then we're also going to be showcasing a couple of decks, including deck lists for this new format, and just talk a little bit about which decks are going to benefit from the situation and which decks are maybe not so great right now, whether you're going to include those Mulcharmy cards in your own decks or whether you're just planning to pick a deck that's good against them. This video should be for you. I hope it's helpful. If it is, make sure to leave a like and a comment down below and subscribe to the channel. Also, feel free to check out the description down below for all other ways to support the channel. For example, we've got Patreon now, and we've got a stream set up next week where people can decide what deck I play, for example, and all other kinds of things that are connected to the Patreon. So feel free to check it if you want to support the channel. Without further ado, hope you enjoy the video. First things first, everyone, remember to dismantle your Chandras and your Sangan summonings if you have them. I already did it this morning just so I make sure to not forget. For this pack, it's a big one, even though the archetypes featured in this pack are not the greatest. Despite the fact that I don't think Ashened is going to be any meta relevant, I am kind of excited to try it out simply because I thought the deck looked fun in the TCG and I got myself the cards, but I actually haven't gotten to play with them yet. We're going to try it just for a couple of games because I want to. Other than that, of course, Varudras is a big deal for Yubel. We've got Light and Darkness package, which the fusion monster is not super relevant. I guess Branded can theoretically make it. The bigger deal about this thing is that this dragon is actually quite good in Dragon Link versions. The reason why, even with the archetypes not being super relevant in this pack, the pack is still going to change the way we play Master Duel significantly is because of these two guys here, Mulcharmy Purulia and Mulcharmy Fuvalos. However, do not be fooled into anyone calling these guys Maxx C Now. It's a red flag, basically. Anyone who says there's 9 Maxx Cs in Master Duel now does not know what they're talking about. All right, these cards are good cards. However, especially Mulcharmy Purulia, I think is not going to see that much play because the big balancing factor with these two cards, the first requirement to activate these cards, if you control no cards, you can discard this card. Having to control no cards in order to activate these means that they're basically unusable when you go first, because when you go first, over 90% of the time, unless you completely break or something really unexpected happens, you're gonna have some sort of board. Even if you get Nibiru or even if you activate a field spell just to start playing, all of that counts. You can't activate Mulcharmies if you control any kind of card, which means that the big drawback of these cards, similar to other cards like Dark Ruler No More or Evenly Matched, is that going first, they're essentially dead cards. In best of one, where you don't have game 2 and 3 to like side deck these cards in or out of your deck, makes these cards a lot less flexible. They are less of a staple than they are in the TCG or OCG. I'm not saying these cards are not going to see play, because they will. They are good Yugioh cards, but there's a little bit more thought that you have to put into playing these cards than Maxx C, because Maxx C, it's a simple decision. Card's broken, put it into every single deck. If you go first and make a board, Maxx C behind it is even more disgusting. If you go first with this card in Master Duel, you're going to have dead cards in your deck, right? There's more nuance to it. As a result of that, I think there are scenarios where you will want to play this card, and there are scenarios where you will not want to play this card. On another note, these cards are also less powerful than Maxx C because they draw less cards. Mulcharmy Fuvalos, for instance, draws a card every time your opponent special summons a monster from the deck and or extra deck, which sounds very powerful at first if you think of super broken decks that'll summon a billion times from the extra deck, which certainly exists, but at the same time, there also exist a bunch of decks that can play around this relatively well, and this is something that we've experienced in the TCG for a couple of months now, where there are a bunch of decks that will not give you that many draws under Mulcharmy Fuvalos, and those decks really benefit if everyone is playing these cards in the main deck because they're essentially not very good cards against that deck. For example, stuff like Centurion, Voiceless Voice, Labrynth are all very meta relevant decks that you will run into that Mulcharmy Fuvalos will draw almost no cards against, whereas Maxx C will. And I think that's worth noting. That's important. The biggest reason why you would want to play it is because you can counter some of those decks that don't have a great plan B under Fuvalos, right? Like if there's a deck in the format that people play despite the fact that there is 3 Maxx Cs and 3 Mulcharmy Fuvalos in people's decks that go super hard without having a plan B, you might still want to main deck this card and take the risk. Similar to how cards like Dark Ruler No More or Evenly Matched have seen play in Master Duel, right? They're not super common, even though everyone knows they're good cards, but there's some nuance to using them in best of one. It's a calculated risk, right? If I go first and I put all these cards in my deck, I'm gonna have a bad time. So let me talk about some decks. First off, I think Mulcharmy Fuvalos is gonna see much more play than Mulcharmy Purulia in most decks, simply because in a best of one scenario, if you are gonna risk drawing a dead card going first, you better make sure that that card is impactful when you're going second. And Mulcharmy Purulia, while it is a very good card that's being played a lot in the TCG, is more like a draw 1 to 2 cards kind of thing against most decks, whereas Mulcharmy Fuvalos against certain decks can be a lot better or a lot more restrictive. I think if your deck is weak into Mulcharmy Purulia, don't worry too much about it. The only decks that are going to play Purulia for now, I think, are going to be decks that blind second. Tenpai, I think, is still a thing. And I mean, that's obviously the elephant in the room. Tenpai is one of the decks where you're always going to play the Mulcharmies because you're blinding second. They don't have a downside in this sort of deck. Whether Tenpai is still good enough remains to be seen. My first impression is yes, because best of one, blinding second, having access to the Mulcharmies, that's a pretty big deal. But other than that, I wouldn't expect many decks to run Mulcharmy Purulia in the main deck. Maybe Tearlaments because it's an aqua monster. Maybe Mermail Atlantean once we get those support cards because it's a water that they can discard. But that's the general idea with Mulcharmies, is if you have a way to make use of that card when you're going first, I think then it's reasonable to main deck Mulcharmy Fuvalos. One example that I could think of for this is Chimera. Chimera is a deck that is inherently pretty strong going first, so having Fuvalos to help it going second is nice, as well as if this deck is going first, you do have ways to make use of a Fuvalos that you've drawn. Of course, it still isn't ideal to draw it, but you can discard it for Nightmare Apprentice. You can use it with Chimera Fusion to summon a Guardian Chimera on the opponent's turn. You can summon Magnum the Reliever with it. There is ways how this deck can make use of Mulcharmies even if it's going first, which is why I think Chimera is one of the decks that might still want to main deck Fuvalos in best of one. Another example of a deck, and it's a nice segue into a different topic, is Centurion, because the Centurion field spell, which you're trying to get to in every single setup, requires a discard. So in every single Centurion opener, unless you get completely stopped by your opponent's hand traps, you're gonna have the ability to discard one dead Mulcharmy Fuvalos from your hand. So these are the type of decks where I think if you can mitigate the downside of this card when you go first, I think it's worth main decking. The other aspect that benefits a deck like Centurion in this upcoming format, and that is a big deal, is that it's not weak into the card itself. There are some decks that are not weak into Fuvalos and some decks that are also not weak into Maxx C, which gives them a little bit of a boost if in the beginning people are playing both of these cards in their main decks, right? There's obvious examples like Fluandereeze or something that doesn't special summon at all, but there's a lot of mid-rangey decks that have been gaining a lot of popularity in the TCG as well after Fuvalos' release that just have a solid plan B under this card. If that's the case, that people are playing a lot of these kind of decks like Centurion in Master Duel now, or Tenpai that are blinding second anyways, you might not even want to play this card. And that's the big difference between Fuvalos and Maxx C, and why they're not that comparable in power level, not even close, is because Maxx C is pretty much good against everything. That's not the case with Fuvalos. Card is much weaker going first, and card has a lot of matchups that can actually play around it. The only decks that are heavily punished by this card are like the super heavy combo decks that don't really have a plan B of what kind of setup they can achieve if they get Maxx C'd, or for that matter, Fuvalos. One of those decks is Yubel. Varudras is a really strong card in Yubel, and Yubel is going to receive even more of a buff once the Fiendsmith cards are being added to the game. But for now, Varudras will already basically make Yubel's endboards be borderline unbreakable if it gets to actually pull off its full combo. The problem with this deck is that if this deck gets Maxx C'd or Fuvalos and you don't have an out to it, you will not be able to do much. Any sort of Yubel combo requires multiple special summons from deck deck or extra deck. The only thing you can really do under Maxx C Fuvalos without giving your opponent infinite draws is like Phantom of Yubel pass, which is very weak. Any sort of Unchained combo line to end on Rage plus Trap card, any Appaloosa line, those sort of things will all require a bunch of summons and draws under Maxx C and Fuvalos. And just for context, Fiendsmith Yubel was by far the most powerful deck in the TCG before Fuvalos released, and after Fuvalos release, it dropped to third or fourth, even lower most represented deck. I mean, other decks got stronger, and this card existing just discouraged people from playing Yubel, because essentially, if you get hit with this card, you don't really have much of a plan B, and other decks did. Of course, in Master Duel, it's not just Fuvalos, it's also Maxx C. I think it remains to be seen whether the buff from Varudras actually outweighs the downside of playing one of the decks that is the worst into Mulcharmies and Maxx C. One way you could obviously counteract this sort of development is by putting Droll and Lockbird into your decks, as well as Ash Blossom and Called By and Crossout, but still, it feels like you're playing a very, very gambly game if you're trying to climb with Yubel right now. Voiceless Voice is a deck that I don't think wants to play Fuvalos itself, because you don't have many ways to make use of it when you draw it. However, it is one of those decks that is pretty good into other people's Maxx Cs and Fuvalos, and if those cards are popular, then playing decks that are good against them, I think is nice. Similar note, Furniture Labrynth specifically is a deck that I think benefits a lot from Fuvalos release, because A, your deck is not weak into those cards, and B, this deck can play Fuvalos because if you draw Fuvalos going first, you have Furnitures to get rid of them. That gives Labrynth, a deck that is already pretty strong when going first, a little bit of help going second. Plus, you're gonna have your opponents drawing bad Mulcharmies against you a lot. Ritual Beast, I think, is unfortunately in a pretty bad spot right now, even though it was one of the better decks going into the last Duelist Cup. This deck is very, very weak into Maxx C, Purulia, and Fuvalos. No matter what your opponent is playing, you're gonna have a problem with this deck. Also, this deck cannot really play Droll and Lockbird to counteract the Charmies, because you're relying on too many searches to get things going, so you're still limited to your Ashes, your Called By and Crossout to counteract your opponent's Charmies and Maxx Cs. I don't think Ritual Beast is in a very good spot if people are playing the Charmies in high counts. Snake Eyes has the advantage over Yubel. Two things, actually. Snake Eyes has ways to deal with drawing Fuvalos when it goes first. The Belstar Wanted will give you ways to send the Fuvalos away, but specifically with Divine Temple of the Snake Eye, which I've added back into this list, Snake Eye actually has some ways to play around opponents' Fuvaloses, because you could just go IP Masquerena Divine Temple pass with like 1 or 2 draws, which is a reasonable situation to be in. That's way better than Phantom of Yubel pass, especially because the Fire King portion as well, this is an engine that is super weak into Maxx C, but it's not actually very weak into Fuvalos. You can actually still do almost the entirety of your Fire King combos without summoning from deck or extra deck, because they mostly summon from hand or graveyard, which is another big difference between Fuvalos and Maxx C, is how certain archetypes actually play under this sort of restriction relatively well. The same is true for other fire decks like Rescue Ace or something like that. You could theoretically also revisit under the Charmies. You notice the more I'm talking about different decks, or I'm hoping that you notice, that there is a lot more nuance to Mulcharmies than there is to Maxx C, which is why I actually thought the design in hindsight was a lot better than I anticipated. When these cards came out in the TCG, especially Mulcharmy Fuvalos, I was very skeptical, but looking back at it now, it actually turned out a lot better than I anticipated it being, because there's better ways to play around it. There's more decks that don't auto-lose to those cards. One of the most frustrating things of Maxx C is when your opponent makes a board and Maxx Cs you. Not possible with Mulcharmy Fuvalos. And I do think in a best of one scenario that we have in Master Duel, there is a lot more things you have to consider before just slapping those cards into your deck, because I do think that people will play decks that have plan Bs into the Mulcharmies. If you're facing off against Centurion, Voiceless Voice, Labrynth, Chimera, all these kind of decks, you don't necessarily need Mulcharmies in your deck in best of one. You would rather have other hand traps or board breakers or even just more engine than a Charmy. The Charmies only really discourage people from playing the super over-the-top combo decks like Yubel, and that's the main difference between Maxx C, because Maxx C basically punishes any sort of combo play that isn't just like set 5 pass or stun, essentially. I'm hoping that's a little more clear, and I'm hoping that I was able to give you guys a little bit of an idea of which kind of decks I think are viable. And of course, it always opens up the potential, if people are playing 3 Maxx Cs and 3 Fuvalos, I'm also going to be messing around with some of my pet decks like Paleo or something, which also just does not care at all about being hit with any of the Mulcharmies, really. Other than that, from the new pack, I'm not going to give you guys any like input on Drytron because I am not a Drytron expert. Ashened is a deck that I'm going to try out myself. I actually have it built here. This is a very first draft of a list. I have no idea if it's like the best way to play Ashened or not. I haven't played it yet. I want to try this deck because it looks fun, but I don't actually have high hopes in terms of competitive viability. If you are not looking to play Drytron or Ashened with this new pack, I think you are better off just crafting the Mulcharmies that you need and then move on. And then in regards to the new ban list, I've also built a Dragon Link deck with the new Dark End Evaporation Dragon. I think I'm gonna play this deck a little bit for fun. However, I also will say with this deck, I think it does struggle with Mulcharmy Fuvalos a little bit. Maybe a better way to play dragons could be a more control-y version, not Dragon Link, but more like the Bestial control. I was thinking of building a deck where you main deck Mulcharmy Fuvalos and maybe even Perulia. Your plan is going to be to go Seal's Pass, you know, the dreaded FTK. And what you do then on the opponent's turn is you activate Seal's effect, tribute it for cost, and at that point you have no cards on the field, so you can even use your Charmies going first. That was kind of like my idea, but that's not what this list is. This is just traditional Dragon Link with Dark End Evaporation Dragon, but that's something that I'm gonna also explore with at some point. That is overall my take on the new pack and Mulcharmies and Master Duel. I think they're only gonna be a pain in the ass if you're dealing with specifically Tenpai. If you're always going second, then yeah, these cards are always auto-include in your deck because there's no real downside to it. The only thing that this does is it makes the Tenpai mirror match even worse.